Pleasure. Thanks for
Hi,
having me.
everyone. Thanks for joining us. We have an audience online as well, so I'm going to try to project as much as possible. Thanks so much. This is the second in our series of Cybersecurity for Democracy's Lab Talks. We did one a month ago. Excited to continue the conversations. For those especially tuning in online, let me just introduce a little bit what Cybersecurity for Democracy is and what we do. And then I'll introduce our speakers. So you'll hear me call it C4D, that's our acronym. And we are a research-based, nonpartisan, independent effort to expose online threats to our safety, our health, and our democracy and social fabric. And then we recommend how to counter those threats. We're multi-university based. We're based both out of NYU, where we are today, and Northeastern, where Laura teaches. And we're really take the amazing computer science research that the various members of the lab conduct and figure out how to also translate that into potential policy solutions, or at least for the public, for journalists, for policymakers to understand these online systems better. So today we're here to talk really about how do social media feeds really work, and the reasons why it's so important to understand this. I mean, right now, a lot of you have seen so much news about social media design on trial. We see what's happening with these cases in Los Angeles and New Mexico. And I mean, more than 1,400 other cases in the works, including this big multi-district litigation from the attorneys general across the country. And these are really starting to address this question of how social media platforms are actually designed and whether those designs are actually causing harm and what that means. So with that backdrop, really excited to have our two speakers today to unpack both research behind how these feeds work and then some of the legal and policy implications. Laura Edelson, in addition to being the Director of Cybersecurity for Democracy, is an assistant professor of computer science at Northeastern. She received her PhD in computer science from right here at NYU. She's also served as the chief technologist in the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice and as the chief technologist of the Antitrust Division at DOJ. So one of those rare birds who has amazing computer science expertise, but also has worked in government, and so can kind of bridge both of those languages. And then next to me here is Olivier Sylvain. He's a professor of law at Fordham University and a senior policy research fellow at Columbia University's Knight First Amendment Institute. His research focuses a lot on information and communications law and policy, and really thrilled that you could join us because again, one of the things we really want to make sure is that the research that is conducted here at NYU and Northeastern really factors into some of the legal and policy conversations around these issues. So with that, the way we conduct these talks is we're going to start by having Laura present some of her research, some of the findings. Then I'm going to turn it over to Olivier to react a bit and to talk a bit about the policy and legal implications. And then I'm going to lead a bit of a fireside chat, which feels funny in a conference room to call it a fireside chat. And of course, we're going to open it up to Q&A, both from the folks in the room, and anybody on the live stream is welcome to put a question in the chat and we can read those out as well. So right now, I'm going to start by turning it over to Laura. She's going to discuss her research into social media feed algorithms.
Hey, folks. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to dive right in. So the work I'm presenting today came from two different papers. The first was called Into the Driver's Seat with Social Media Content Feeds, and this was published by the Knight First Amendment Institute's occasional paper series. And there was a second paper that did not have as cool graphics that was published by the Transaction on Recommender Systems and was called A Comparative Survey of Social Media Content feeds. This work was all done with Frances Haugen and Damon McCoy. Okay, so today we're gonna go through a few things, and we're gonna go through them pretty quickly. We're gonna talk about what feeds are, what the primary components of them are. We're going to talk about our framework for for characterizing the various aspects of feed algorithms. We're going to talk super briefly about at least one feed algorithm that we evaluated through this lens, and we're going to talk a little bit about why, at least I think, measurement of these characteristics is so important. Okay, so why should you care about feed algorithms at all? And the basic answer is, at this point, it appears that feed algorithms drive a large majority of the user experiences with content that people have on social media. So this is, when I say appear, we don't know. We really do not know the breakdown between how much content people consume via search and how much they consume via feed. Um, I'm very interested in doing that kind of work, but we just don't know. So we think this. So let's start with that. And this is particularly true on social media platforms that have created their products at this point around feeds and have made that, in effect, the front page of their products. So we're not talking about every single social media platform that has done this, but at this point, a vast majority of the eyeballs that we are talking about when we're talking about social media really forward social media feeds. Okay, so what that means is, if we care about user experiences on social media, we need to care about how feed algorithms function. So if we care about how feed algorithms function, let's go over the basics so we can stop treating them like a monolith. There's three basic stages of how all feed algorithms work. The first stage is inventory selection. On most platforms, there's probably something north of 1 billion content items that exist. Again, when we're talking about numbers this big, it gets a little fuzzy, but on any platform that you might consider relevant, so we're talking YouTube, we're talking TikTok, we're certainly talking X, Facebook, Instagram, there's probably a pool of, at minimum, 1 billion items. So that's just an enormous pool. And so the first stage is just selecting the items, and this small pool is going to be in the 1 to 2 digit thousand items that a user would be eligible to be shown to an item. So we're going to draw from that pool somehow, and we'll get into talking about how that works later. But after I've got that pool of items, then I need to rank all of those items. So there is a ranking function, and that ranking function is going to it's going to be an objective function that combines several different values. Sorry, my slides appear to have gotten squashed. Um, but it might be something like, I'm going to make a prediction about the likelihood that the user is going to comment. I'm going to make a prediction about the likelihood that the user might do some other reaction, like a like. I'm going to also make a prediction about some kind of negative outcome, like they're going to end their session. And I'm going to combine all of those things into a ranking score. And then ultimately, I'm going to assemble their feed. Now, this is mostly going to be based on those ranking scores, but there's other holistic goals that that you might have for users' feed that mean that you're not going to strictly order what you show a user by those ranking scores. So one very simple thing that happens is almost every platform inserts ads. Those come through an entirely different channel, and they're inserted at some cadence. But also, I might have other kinds of goals, like ensuring I don't show the same video from two different sources right next to each other things like that, that mean there's some jiggering in this final assembly process. So the whole pipeline might look something like this, where maybe I have inventory selection for a few different categories of things. I'm going to rank all those things, and then I'm going to put it all together and show them to the user. So that is how that's just like the basic process that every feed algorithm, wherever it is, that is how it works in those three stages. But obviously, there are huge, huge differences between what that feels like as a feed when you're on Reddit and what it feels like when you're on TikTok and what it feels like when you're on YouTube. And so the goal of our framework is to start to surface the characteristics that um, represent those different aspects of user experience. So, uh, one of the most important things here, I was talking about inventory selection. And so inside this cars analogy, we think about inventory selection as being a little bit like fuel composition. The inventory is just the basic material that makes the feed go. It makes it function. And there are three big categories of inventory in terms of how platforms see it. There's directly connected content, and this is content that a user has at some point sent some kind of explicit signal that they want to see. There's also indirectly connected content. And indirectly connected content, this is content that the platform has some reason to think that a user may be related to it, but they've never sent an explicit signal. So on a platform like Facebook that is very much driven by a social graph, this is something like content from people who aren't the people you know, but the people you know. It's like an indirect relationship. On more content focused platforms, this is something like maybe you have an interest in yoga and other people who also have an interest in yoga. They also have an interest in, I don't know, Pilates. And so maybe the platform will experiment with showing you content on Pilates because that's like an indirectly related interest. And then there's unconnected content. And unconnected content is just basically everything else. It's everything in the broader universe of stuff that the platform has no reason to think that you have an interest or a knowledge about. Okay. And then, that's the different bones of inventory selection. Now, our framework, in addition to surfacing these characteristics of how information gets into the pipeline, we also describe 4 characteristics of ranking algorithms. So, ranking algorithms, they have these 4 properties that every ranking algorithm will vary from high to low on, and so you should think about these as things that not a feed has or doesn't have, but has, like, to a greater or lesser extent. But everything has these. So the first of these categories is intensity. So this characteristic of intensity is another way of thinking about this is this a feed that is very actively engaging me, that is very interactive, where I'm commenting, I am reacting, in some way I'm like touching my screen, I'm interacting with the content? Or is it very passive intensity, where maybe I'm just watching it and I'm watching it go by, but I'm not necessarily doing something? So very interactive is high intensity, very passive is low intensity. And this is something, as all these characteristics are, this is something that we propose metrics for. And so we define the intensity of a feed algorithm as overall the number of interactions per the session duration in minutes. So there are some feed algorithms like, and we'll get into this a little bit later, YouTube, where many minutes may go by before a user interacts by liking or subscribing. And then there's others like TikTok or Instagram, where there might even be multiple interactions per minute. Okay, that's been my 10 minutes.
Yeah, but I want you to at least do the what's the point section.
Okay, I'll go through these as quickly as I can. Okay, so the next of these characteristics is timeliness. We think that timeliness is best represented by the Gini score, but the way to think of this in terms of the intuition is, am I seeing stuff from the last few hours, or am I seeing stuff from the last year? And maybe it's from a few hours ago, maybe it's from 6 months ago, maybe it's from a year ago. So there are some feeds that, like Pinterest, you can see things from years ago, and there's others like X where you're just seeing kind of the last few hours. We also define novelty. Novelty is, in effect, how surprised am I by the content that I see? And there are some platforms that have an explicit goal of surfacing to you things that you have never seen before, and discovery is explicitly part of in effect the platform promise. And then there's others where the platform promise is we will show you exactly what you expect to see. And so here we have some other another metric for this, but I'm going to just keep going. Um, the final characteristic is specificity. And so specificity is something, the way I think about it is, in general, how many, for most of the stuff you see on the platform, is this something that is very specific to you and you will love? Or is this something that is very unspecific to you and maybe you won't love, but you're not going to hate? So items that are very low specificity, everybody likes, but some people, and no one really hates. Items that are very high specific, some people love, some people hate. Okay, so ultimately we define this window sticker for feed algorithms. And we proposed this as a way of making these different characteristics transparent to users, where you could effectively like graph all four of these characteristics, and users could make decisions based on what they like. To go right to what's the point? For me, the point of all this work is that clearly for some people, for some feeds, something is going wrong. Where for some people, for some feeds, they're making their online lives worse. They're making their experiences worse. But we really don't understand that well. We don't know why that's happening, and we don't know specifically what is causing that. And my touchstone for a lot of this work has been really the crisis in automotive safety in the 1960s. So Ralph Nader published this book, Unsafe at Any Speed, at least in part based on the Chevrolet Corvair. And that book was published in 1965, and it created a broad public awareness of this safety problem. And when that book was published, it created demand to create the National Highway and Transportation Safety Administration. And they started doing things like crash testing cars and thinking about the different aspects of cars that actually were hurting people. And what that meant is that over over the last 100 years, the number of automotive deaths has fallen dramatically, while the number of vehicle miles traveled has increased dramatically. And so ultimately, this is why I think it is so important to understand how feeds work on a granular level, so that we can start measuring, which of these characteristics are associated with harm, if any. And that's going to be the first step toward making them safer.
Thank you. So really quickly before we move on to Olivier, we're going to unpack like how a lot of this applies to, again, some of the cases we're seeing today, and some of the way we hope that courts and policymakers start thinking about social media, for example, when weighing all these different options. I want to draw out one sentence because I reread the longer version of the paper just last night. And one like example that really brought it home for me, you wrote in there, for example, if a feed algorithm has high timeliness, then if the platform's content moderation pipeline doesn't operate in a similarly timely fashion, the content feed may recommend unreviewed, policy violating content to many users. It's insights like that that show why understanding which of all these different options any particular feed is using, what the implications of those design choices could be, that really brought it home for me. So before I ask you a bunch of questions, we're going to now move over to Olivier to speak a bit about reactions to the paper, but also some of the work that you've been doing and thinking about in terms of the legal and policy implications.
Thank you, Yael. It's a treat to be here, and such a great pleasure to sit on a panel with these two folks who I admire, different reasons, but for the same reason, on the same sorts of issues. I've learned a lot from both, different ways. I'm also happy to be in this space. I knew that I would be the only person with a tie on when I walked in, and even in law schools, it's a rare sight, but definitely in an engineering building. Thank you for bearing with that. I will go back to the law school later today. Um, so I mean, I'm not a technologist at all, and so you know, what I've done, to the extent I've been paying attention to this area for the past decade, is think about public law norms and how they are in tension with or consistent with the design decisions that companies are making. Um, so my intervention here will just really be responsive to an excellent paper, from which I've learned a ton and have a handful of reactions. And we don't have a lot of time. We'll open it up for conversation. But I will say, you know, I like this last point you left with regards to the cars. Um, the problem in the cases that are proceeding is how to define harm and determine what the harm is. And, you know, I think there are individual plaintiffs who have claims about harm, but I think a lot of I'm sure a lot of people who are policymakers, voters, are thinking about the harms as a social phenomenon. That is, that there are externalities that these companies do not internalize, and at a minimum, that gets us to think about the range of harms that are, you know, never really manifest in the ways in which decisions the companies make their decisions, right? And so the way we are seeing this is through litigation, and pushing the envelope on litigation. And one last throat clearing point here. My intervention in these areas is really about talking about constitutional and statutory protections that companies invoke to shield public law inquiries into the design decisions they're making. Happy to talk more about that. The three of us have talked about this quite a bit. Okay, so what I like most about this project, is that it makes plain that design choices are not natural or inevitable, that they're decisions that companies are making. I think at a minimum, that's the most important takeaway. And it, for many people, isn't obvious. I mean, many people just assume that there is an authentic articulation of what a feed ought to look like. But clearly, there are all these decisions at work and non-decisions. I really like the example you pulled out from the paper where there's a, you know, kind of mismatch between inventory and design capacity, or I mean, that's how I received your point. There are other ways in which these companies could design these feeds. They could use bridge-based algorithms that try to find the most popular content across people who are otherwise polarized. But that doesn't work well with a business model that the piece talks about, and that is optimizing engagement. That's the language that those of us who've been coming to this from law use to talk about retaining attention. Um, and I mean, the point is that all of these techniques, these features, these design choices are in service of this point. Um, the way we know that this is not inevitable, that the way that they currently operate these things is not inevitable, is because just a couple of years ago they were doing things differently than they are now. November 2024 was a fateful time because a lot of companies seem to reconsider the decisions about moderating content. I mean, to be sure, even before the presidential election, Meta shut down CrowdTangle as a opportunity for researchers to gain access into what these companies doing. But this was in the direction of a more ostensibly hands-off approach to how content comes out and reaches or how content reaches consumers. Those were design decisions, is what I just want to observe. It was arguably a shrewd recognition of the political winds after years of pressure from the right, in particular, about the woke mind virus. That's the language that the head of X uses to describe what was going on. So, with regards to Laura and Frances Haugen and Damon McCoy's paper, I think it's such an important intervention in the wake of these changes to return us to the realization that these are design choices that companies are making. And what is really interesting is the language you use, or you say there are traditional recommender systems, and then there are the current practices. Um, you know, I know exactly what that I think that means. I mean, it's tracking. I think it tracks, and maybe you'll correct me if I'm wrong. This historical evolution of the past couple of years. What counts as traditional? These actually want to know what you mean by that. In terms of timing, like what makes it traditional versus current. But I have a feeling that the current political mood at these companies has something to do with what is considered traditional or not. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Um, what is most interesting and maybe provocative for law purposes is the taxonomy of, of content. So directly connected content, indirectly connected content, and unconnected content. This gives me pause for reasons that are unrelated to the veracity of the claims. Just give me pause because um, in the United States, especially after the Supreme Court's decision in Moody versus NetChoice, the general view is that these companies can make editorial decisions about the kinds of content they deliver. So the design argument that I and others have made, and I know Yael has made, and is that these are not just about content delivery, but about a whole set of other features that keep people hooked. So I'd love to get your reaction to that. I mean, let me put this a little differently. I have the sense that the unconnected category is the most protected after Moody versus NetChoice, only because the company's making decisions that are unrelated to stuff the users have given them. So it really is a pure editorial decision, perhaps that ought to be insulated from public inquiry or public law inquiry, just because it might present First Amendment problems. I'm just throwing it out there to see what your reaction is to that. The one piece you didn't mention here that struck me, and I'm jumping to things that provoked me, and I think might generate conversation, is this point about how social media are multi-stakeholder systems. How much time do I have? Like 1 or 2 minutes?
I was so into it. Oh yeah, you still have 2 minutes.
Okay. So that they are multi-stakeholder systems. I've been writing about. I come to tech and law through telecommunications. I worked at a law firm that did a lot of telecommunications work, and the language of multi-stakeholderism was prominent in the early 2000s, talking about internet connectivity and broadband connectivity. Not just language that's particular to telecom. This is the language that people have been using to describe network communications. So there are papers about the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, as a multi-stakeholder body, ICANN, et cetera. And I think all of this project of associating interventions with multi-stakeholders, I mean, this is my provocation to you, dilutes the importance of public law. That is, it equates the technical decisions and the marketing decisions and advertising decisions with what law requires. And I don't blame, the people who are talking about multi-stakeholderism. If there's anyone to blame, and I say this with due respect, and it's a project I'm thinking about. Lawrence Lessig writes "Code is Law," and it kind of in 1999 as a kind of as a challenge to policymakers who believe that regulation through law is the only way to attend to. It's exactly right to say that there are other ways to advance public law norms and regulate behavior. Technologists have an important role to play, but it dilutes the legitimacy or the force that public law ought to play. And so when you say that these are multi-stakeholder organizations, I worry that it removes the sense of obligation that these companies ought to have singularly, apart from those of technologists like you commenting on them, or users. Because users are part of your taxonomy of multi-stakeholders, but in a market of as asymmetric as this one, it just seems
Cop out.
incomplete. That's the word I would use right now. It's a provocation. I'd love to see what your reaction is to that. I have many more thoughts. Can I make one more
Yes.
point?
Make one more point.
So recommender systems are certainly the subject du jour. I mean, they're what many people talk about, and just former Chief Justice, the late Chief Justice of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals with sits in New York, in a case called Force versus Facebook, in a case involving allegations that Facebook and YouTube and others were facilitating matching terrorists with prospective terrorists. He says in his dissent that there are protections for these companies, and Congress ought to revisit this. And it still stands as a kind of really important statement by a very important judge who's now passed away. And even the Ninth Circuit, in a case similar facts, says we are bound by what the laws say now, but we're really worried in the way that Judge Katzmann was worried about recommender systems. The thing I want to say is that there are other features at work, and the litigation, the trials in LA and in New Mexico and elsewhere, um, illustrate that they're not just recommender systems that we're worried about, right? Randomized chat rooms where children are meeting adults. When I say randomized, not based on some selection criteria that the users have provided, or the infinite scroll, right? Those are design choices that clearly trigger engagement and make it hard to leave, et cetera. These are the kinds of design features that are in the litigation, and also really important for those of us who worry about regulatory interventions that address content. So I'll stop there.
All right, so a lot to unpack here. I saw Laura lean forward on the multi-stakeholder question, so I'm going to come back to that one in a minute. We have about 15 minutes for a conversation, and then we're going to open it up to questions. I also want to mention, sort of tying some of this together, we recently worked together with the Electronic Privacy Information Center, EPIC, on an amicus brief in some of these cases. And what we did, and Olivier was one of the law scholars who signed on to the brief. Again, what people are trying to differentiate right now is pure content, which is the whole Section 230 debate, which I'm going to try my best not to get into that whole debate right now, or I'll take over the rest of the conversation. From more of the design, the things that the platforms are doing that do not necessarily involve content, but it involves provoking or invoking a behavior or a way a user uses the platform. And so we worked together on this amicus brief. And what was so interesting, as someone who's worked on these issues for a long time, was bringing together the technology knowledge, the legal knowledge, and the privacy experts at EPIC all together on a brief. And we heard in the oral arguments in Boston on one of the cases, we heard the Supreme Court justices in Boston actually describe some of these features correctly.
So satisfying.
And not to overly take credit, but like directly from our op-ed and our amicus briefs. And so maybe I want to take a step back before we get into the weeds and talk a bit about why it is so important both to collaborate across disciplines, but to make sure that the technologists are speaking to the legal experts and the legal experts are speaking to the technologists. So maybe we can just discuss a bit. Maybe I'll start with Olivier. Like, how have you seen some of this conversation evolve from some courts who seem to have no technological know-how to some of these conversations are maturing? I'd love to hear a bit about some of the arguments you see playing out in the courts, and does it feel like they're understanding the types of things Laura is talking about?
Yes, it's happening. We're seeing it happen. You've mentioned the oral argument to me before. I was looking for the word that Laura used in her presentation. That is that these companies are not a monolith. They're constituted of different design features, decisions that are directed to accomplish different pecuniary objectives. And what's nice is that we're seeing more and more courts do it. I would actually start with the Supreme Court in the Moody versus NetChoice case, which is a First Amendment case, because at issue are Texas and Florida's efforts to regulate recommender algorithms on social media. But NetChoice, the trade group, brings a facial challenge to the statute. That means they want the whole thing to go down. And the court says, well, hold on a second. The Supreme Court, hold on a second. We don't have enough facts to talk about all of the features that these companies make available. You want to talk about recommender feeds? We'll give you our view on recommender feeds. But what about direct messaging, right? And your laws do not distinguish between direct messaging and recommender feeds. I mean, that kind of thing. So that case has gone back down because NetChoice was overzealous in its argument about the monolith. It's a feature-driven analysis that is going to proceed. We're now seeing, that's the First Amendment setting. We're also seeing that in Section 230 litigation. And the allegations that the plaintiffs have brought in the trials that people are paying attention to are addressed to specific design features, like the ones I mentioned a second.
So Laura, I was
Want
wondering,
to say
oh,
one other thing
yeah.
about just this question of interdisciplinary work, because you know, Olivia, you say, well, I'm not a technologist, but I think one of the single hardest things about doing the kind of work you do in the law is that it is exactly some of the things we're talking about here. This is what's so hard about interdisciplinary work. We use words in fundamentally different ways. We have different baked in assumptions in our fields about if you run analysis this way, what is the default assumption? And that is just we start from a different default place. And I think for all of us, it is just so easy to sort of retreat to our own spheres. And I think what's so interesting and hard about this issue, and I think it's something that, and I've said this to you before, I think it's something that the law is uniquely well suited to do, is the law is how we like publicly ingest hard issues and how we integrate them into our society. And so I think as much as it is frustrating hearing judges fundamentally misunderstand technology, it is something that has been slowly getting better over time, and it's because of scholarship like yours.
Thank you. Which is based on scholarship from you. So
We did it.
I've written a couple of essays that rely, in my book, cites you too. So
Which I am going to make sure we announce to everyone before the end of this session. I'm going to throw this to either of you or both of you. In Laura's paper, there's also, obviously I read it very carefully last night. She makes a point in the paper, which is one a lot of us have also made over the years, which is key to some of the arguments in these cases. These companies, and by these companies, obviously I mean social media companies, they're going to continue to argue that their algorithmic feeds are showing users what they want to see. This is an argument we hear over and over again. We are a mirror to society. We are showing you what you want to see. And as you point out in your paper, that's an argument that at least implies that the user actually bears the primary responsibility for the contents of their feeds. And I think your paper does a good job of pointing out that there's some ways that that's somewhat accurate. There are ways that it's not. I would love to hear from either or both of you. What do you think are some of the most common misperceptions or misunderstandings of how social media feeds work? Whether it's in the public conversation, whether it's some of the things you're hearing in these cases right now.
I think for me, one of the things that came out of this analysis, and I didn't get into this, but the way we did this analysis is we based it on patents, source code analysis when that was available, academic papers these platforms published. And what we found is, in effect, there was a very close match between how platforms feed algorithms worked and what their business model was. So platforms that primarily sold attention on effectively like a per minute basis, they sold attention by views. They had algorithms that generally favored longer duration usage. Platforms that sold attention on an engagement basis, like a per click basis, they primarily had algorithms that maximized engagement. I know this sounds really obvious that someone would make a product to serve their business model, but I think that it's one of the things that people just simply, they think about products as like dragons roaming the land. They don't think about them as things that were made to generate a profit, which is what they are. And I think for me, it is really, really useful to remember they're just like any other product in a consumer capitalist society. They're there to maximize profit for the business holder.
So before I come to you on this, can I follow up with something? Why do you think it also matters, in addition to understanding that these are products, why do you think it would matter maybe for a lawmaker or a judge to understand the difference between, for example, how a YouTube feed works versus an Instagram feed?
Well, I think one of the questions that always comes up in a legal context that we never think of as technologists is, but is there could they do this any other way? Because the answer is yes, there's always another way, right? And we think about that a lot because we think about, the way things are built. But a lot of times to courts, something just seems like what it is. And a rock can't be anything other than what it is. But YouTube's feed could be very different. Like YouTube's feed is the result of choices that people who work at YouTube made to serve the business model that they wanted to pursue. And I think that's, yeah. What do you think?
So a little bit back to some of the same question about some common misperceptions or misunderstandings, but also like, what do you think's been missing from the conversations about social media and harm? I mean, some of that is shifting now, but from the legal perspective or the policy, what do you think's missing from these conversations or misunderstood?
Yeah, so my answer was going to be a version of what Laura said, probably better than I was going to say it. That the most important thing is that we think of these as commercial enterprises in the business of, um, you know, maximizing revenue from advertisers, and that they're not. So what's missing? Another way to put this is that they are not the language of platforms that Tarleton Gillespie critiques in his really important essay on this from now over a decade ago, right? It's been a while, is important. That these are not neutral conduits. They're not realizing user interests like some authentic thing that is a user interest. They are conditioning it and driving it. I just in the IP setting, I just taught my information law class, and today we talked about the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and we talked about the the litigation, how litigation revealed that Viacom versus YouTube litigation revealed that the YouTube founders in the early days knew very well why they kept some stuff up, even though they were supposed to take it down because it was going to drive revenue. This ought to be common sense, but it I think there is a prevalent view that these are neutral platforms or conduits or kind of they're that they're worse public squares. They're none of those things, and I think it's really important for us to fight back against that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm smiling because obviously that is very in line with some of the things that frustrate me. The people in this room understand these systems. So the people in this room are probably like, wait, people actually still think that these are just neutral platforms that show you what you want to see or that free speech flows through. Yes, a lot of people still believe that. I was listening to a podcast, I won't name which one, on the way here this morning, unpacking the arguments around the current cases in Los Angeles and New Mexico. And they were just outraged that anybody thinks of this as anything other than just a neutral platform.
Well, I mean, we can put it even more starkly, and I alluded to this a moment ago. And if this sounds like I'm making a political point, I don't mean to make this as a political point. The social media and consumer-facing applications generally have transformed into something like a champion for a sector of our political life as forums for free speech. That decisions to take down content because it's bigoted or spreads lies about public health or foreign influence are thought to be authentic articulations of what people believe, right? And that intruding on their decisions about content is an intrusion on the authentic articulation of what society is. Again, that's right. I'm answering your point by saying yes, it's prevalent, and there are many people, maybe people in this room even, who believe that there's something that there's speech actors, that they're enabling engagement and discussion that is not otherwise possible. There's a really good paper that I just came across that I referred to in a paper I wrote about middleware not too long ago. I want to get the authors' names. I forgot. I'll remember them. About Becca Lewis and Angèle Christin. I don't. They at Stanford. They write a paper about the different meanings of the polysemy of engagement. There's a sense of engagement, which sounds like Robert Putnam's story, which is like political engagement. There's another engagement story that entrepreneurs have, as I understand it, in the early 2000s. It's about growth, that a lot of these social networks exist for growth. And then there's the engagement that I think is most important, and that is the one that is in service of the bottom line, the commercial bottom line.
So before I go to questions, I'm just going to ask one more. I also want to just do a quick plug. In 2 weeks, in 1 week, you have a new book coming out that actually kind of lays out this story and the history and where we are. And is it coming? If you want to just
March
mention
17th. Thank you very much. March 17th, book comes out. It's called Reclaiming the Internet. Not really my title, but I'll take it. There are many people who have commentary about platforms. A couple law professors do as well. My take is that we should resist the laissez-faire approach to platforms because they're not free speech forums.
So pick that up if you're interested. Laura, I'm going to throw the last question to you, and then I'm going to open it to the room. Because you brought up the fact that in the amicus brief we filed, one of the things we did was you did patent analysis. So all these features are what's really being explored in these cases, right? Whether it's infinite scroll, intermittent rewards, all these different features. And what I loved about that so much was don't take me at my word as a computer scientist. Don't take me at my word as a legal scholar. Here's what the company itself wrote in its patents about why they designed something a certain way. Can you maybe just give us one example from that, or a thought on that?
Sure, but can I first plug to all the students in the room, if you can, after you have to do some kind of brutal, really annoying data collection and analysis project, if you can find a twofer and like publish a policy paper, write an amicus brief, it's so satisfying because you didn't have to do the very annoying thing a second time. So let me recommend that to you. So yeah, so I had the great pleasure of learning how to read patents for this project. And I think the thing that, engineers and scientists, we're going to do what we're going to do, which is to say we're going to write everything down very carefully, exactly how we're going to do things. And I think, so this one didn't even make it into the brief, but it was one that I found that was just like, it was both technically very interesting for reasons I'm not going to get into, but also it was just so plain and bald. There is a YouTube patent that describes how they monitor your, like, if you have YouTube up on your TV and you are also scrolling other like Google and YouTube products on your phone, they will look at your on your mobile device behavior to show you better ads on your TV while you are doing that like dual screen session. And I just thought about like the people who are watching YouTube both on their TV and their phone. And also, again, like there's actually a very interesting method in how they handle that embedding space. So yeah, interesting for multiple aspects.
Take them at their own word because they literally patented it. All right, so
Can I say
Yeah.
something? So I'm really curious also now why Laura leaned forward when I talked about multi-stakeholders.
oh yeah, sorry.
I didn't hear
And then
you.
looked over
I
at
was
a
trying
co-author.
to poke at you and see what you would say at that.
So I think I have sort of two strands of thought here. One is that, when in computer science we talk about multi-stakeholder systems, we are thinking about it and using that term, I think, in a very different way than in the law, where I think in the law it becomes something that every stakeholder uses to abdicate responsibility,
Right.
whereas in the computer science world we mean it a little more of like, remember that there are other people here too, and that they have like rights and needs and voices that need to be considered. I think the other thing that I will, it is a, very often we use terms like that as a way of signaling like a much larger area of consideration, which is basically this isn't just going to be a paper about industry. So
All right, questions. Don't be shy. And we can look also and see if there's any online. And if you can there are microphones that are going to catch you, but if you can try to speak a little bit loudly.
Sure. My question was going back to the first part of the presentation. I was wondering when you brought up the novelty score slide. I guess what I'm wondering is how does the novelty score get balanced with, like, avoiding showing content that the user would have no interest in per se?
yeah, so that's very hard. And this is so the long story short is that if you're going to make novelty part of your platform promise, which some platforms do, you have to have a certain amount of tolerance for occasionally showing users things that they have no interest in. Right? Like, I'm sure you've had, so TikTok is, I think, the platform that makes this promise most explicitly. Sometimes TikTok shows you things that you're not interested in at all. And this is also integrated into other design affordances where when TikTok shows you something that you're not interested in at all, it's very low stakes. You just swipe it away. When YouTube shows you something that you don't like because things like the load timer is longer and like navigating to the next video is just slower. If you want to navigate to the next video, it's more effortful. Showing you something you don't want to see on YouTube is just a higher stakes affair. And this is probably why YouTube is actually a very low novelty platform. But in essence, novelty represents, in effect, tolerance for occasionally doing just that, because you have to have some tolerance in order to have novelty.
Can I ask a question about that? I mean, I don't think the paper touches on it. If it does, I'm sorry I missed it. Is there a way to evaluate the relationship between novelty and holding consumer user attention or consumer attention? That is, novelty on TikTok yields this versus YouTube.
Yeah, so every platform has this problem where so even platforms that are very, very much driven by things that the user has explicitly signaled that they want to see, that well is not infinite. If the user says, here are 10 people I want to see content from, eventually those 10 people they'll die, or they'll move off the platform, or they'll stop producing content or something. So platforms have this problem where they need to constantly discover new things, new like sources of inventory for the user. And so platforms solve this problem in a variety of different ways. Novelty, having higher novelty, is in effect a way of baking in solving that technical problem into the feed itself. Other platforms will do this by doing things like suggesting people you may like. That's just another way of solving that problem. Or occasionally saying, like, are you interested in this kind of thing, in a way that's separate from just randomly inserting things into your feed.
I guess I'm wondering whether, I'm sorry,
No, go ahead.
whether that's responsive. I'm just wondering whether there are concrete metrics on the efficaciousness, the effectiveness of this technique versus, suggesting new connections.
You know who probably has that data? The
Yes.
companies themselves.
Yeah, we're
I like
getting
to
into
insert
like
that when
very
I can.
closely guarded trade
But
secrets.
you wouldn't, yeah.
And I would say this probably is not a constant across the platform for some of the reasons I mentioned. Like, some of this stuff is affected by other aspects of platform design. But my God, would I love to know? I want all of that data.
That's our plug for transparency and more access for researchers.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I really like how it's like high up on the stack and lower on the stack, just like, and many disciplines. My question is pretty general, and I was thinking about how you both were talking about the need to show that social media platforms are design choices, and that it's not always been that way, or that it doesn't have to be that particular way. And that reminds me of when I was doing privacy research, and we would like try and do transparency, where we would show them like, hey, here are the things that an advertiser could infer about you based on your web browsing. And they would just be like, okay, I guess the computer's right then. Even though they know their own they know their own interests actually. But when people are shown like, this is what a computer might infer about you based on your browsing, they're like, oh, I didn't think I was into that, but maybe I am because the computer said so. And I think we see this a lot with AI, where people are like, oh, if the chatbot says it, then it must be like inherently right. And I was kind of curious about that phenomenon. And it, to me, feels a little bit like techno optimism or techno solutionism, but like a new form of it. And wondering if that's how you all see it, and if that's something we can combat.
I have an immediate reaction. I don't know if you all do, but I on the heels of what Laura and Yael just said about transparency, I know that researchers care a lot about it, and it has mattered a ton for understanding how these companies operate. And they still, all these companies let you know what the principle, if you click the three dots, they'll tell you generally why you're getting something, but it's not a complete account. And that doesn't stop people, right? It doesn't appear to stop people. And my view, I tend to have a kind of skepticism about transparency interventions, not because we shouldn't hold them accountable, we should absolutely hold them accountable. But more important are, because of the information asymmetry, the people you're talking about, they think, oh, the computer must be right, or the service must be right. Meanwhile, there are a set of market asymmetries, where consumers don't really know all the ways in which their information is getting used or abused. And so transparency rules are insufficient, it's as far as I'm concerned. There ought to be concrete rules about what companies do with consumer data, which we don't really have, comprehensively in the United States. That's my immediate reaction.
So one of the things you're getting at is this tension where platforms say, and every technology company says, well, we follow the users. What the users want, that's what happens. And what they mean is what users do, that's what happens. And every researcher in this room has seen the wide gaps between what people say they want on privacy and then like what terms they will agree to, or what people say they want on platform data sharing and then what terms they will agree to. And one of the things that personally that just makes me sad about the way this debate has played out is I don't understand why platforms have been allowed to, in effect, tell people that what they do when they are under duress in a low information situation is a better representation of what they want than like the thoughts that they have in their head about what they want. I think that's outrageous, and I think though that is I think some of that is on us, on the computer science community, to not accept that framing at face value, because why do we have to go along with the idea that what people do in a low information setting when they're under pressure is the right metric of what they want? I don't think we have to go along with that.
I think the companies have a story for why they look to what people say and measure what people do. And that is, and it's the argument the economists make, and that is, it's a revealed preference, right? It's the concrete evidence that this is what they want.
But why though? Why
I'm
is
with
that
you,
a
like,
a-
Okay,
I'm
so
with you,
I'm
like, it's not the right, like. it's
I
not the
just
right
think
measure.
it's a mistake to
time.
think there's a relationship between what people want in a considered way and again, like how they will act in a low information environment.
So before we turn off the live stream, I think this is such an interesting question too, because it also gets into behavior, into persuasion, into all of those questions. I've done the like download your data or see why you're targeted or all those things. Sometimes I'm going to say some of these systems are not as smart as they sell themselves to be. I mean, some of the things that Meta has said that my interests are, you couldn't even persuade me that's my interest. In addition to, as a dog person, they say I'm a cat person, which is so strange. Like some of them are so off, but
Maybe you're a cat person.
no, I'm definitely allergic. I'm definitely a dog person. So, but some of them were kind of silly, and some of them I am skeptical. I thought, maybe actually there is a weird subversive persuasion technique here in telling me that's what I'm interested in. I don't know. But maybe they really do need me to go more towards that advertiser. And so by convincing me that this is my interest and slowly showing me enough to push me more into believing that's my interest serves a purpose. So I don't know the answer, but I've thought about that as well. Before everybody leaves the room though, this is where we're going to end the live stream. Thank you for those who joined us online. We're also going to post it for those who need to watch it later. So thank you to the online audience.